What's interesting about that moment is I don't even know that Mal could see a glint of what the future looked like because all of it was there. But the one area that he'd neglected for so long that was the biggest chasm of grief for him, his family back in London, that was the part that was his undoing.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Ken Womack is a returning guest on the podcast. He and author Jason Krupa appeared a few years back to talk about their book All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs. Today, Ken is here to talk about his latest book titled Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. This is the first full-length biography of Mal Evans, the Beatles' beloved friend, confidant, and roadie. A towering figure in horn-rimmed glasses, Evans loomed large in the Beatles' story, contributing at times as a performer and sometimes lyricist, while struggling mightily to protect his beloved boys. He was there for the whole of the group's remarkable, unparalleled story, leaving a stable job as a telecommunications engineer to serve as road manager for this fledgling band. Mal was the odd man out from the start. Older, married with children, and without any music business experience. And yet he threw himself headlong into their world, traveling across the globe and making himself indispensable. Womack is here to talk about Mal's time with the Beatles, what he did after the breakup of the band, and his mysterious death in January of 1976. Ken Womack, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Very thrilled to be back with you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I should say welcome back because I did have you on for your book on George Harrison and Eric Clapton. Excellent book. And here we go with another one. The story of Mal Evans, his life is fascinating enough. But to read from Mal's son, Gary, how this book came to be is a fascinating story all on its own. He explains in the foreword how this project eventually found its way to you. It all starts with Mal. He's writing his memoir in 75, but then his untimely death and his material ends up in the basement of a building in New York.
Not too far from here. Actually visited it recently. Yeah, so it was never one of my ambitions to write about Mal. I thought he was interesting. I had noticed, like I think everybody who is into this band, you can't help but noticing this fellow in the background photobombing them all the time, right? So I had that kind of natural interest in him. You know, and again, anyone who thinks about the Beatles can't help thinking about the fact that their entourage was two guys, essentially, which is crazy considering today's standards. But Gary contacted me through a mutual friend, Simon Weitzman, in 2020, actually around the beginning of COVID, and said, would you like to tell my dad's story? And I knew I would help Gary out. He's just a sweet guy. I think he's probably a lot like Mal. In fact, half the time I accidentally call him Mal. I knew I would write the book, just to work with Gary, just a wonderful man. And it was at that point that I said, does there really all this stuff? And Gary said, yeah, do you want to see it? And of course, the answer was yes. And he began sending it out here to New Jersey. And that really elevated the entire project.
As for how Mal Evans becomes part of the Beatles organization, it's a simple twist of fate. Lands himself behind the wheel of the band's van, January of 63. Little did he know, he's about to step into a very fast-moving train. The Beatles are about to blow up. Can you talk about what Mal was doing for work at that time? And how does he end up the road manager for the Beatles?
Really, he came to them as a fan. He loved their music. He wandered down those cavern steps sometime in late 61 and was just enamored with them, with their music, was excited by the fact that they liked Elvis. He loved Elvis. That was a natural connection. And he became friends with them long before he would work with them. And by the time he gets to January 63 and things are really moving for them, Mal really proves himself in that famous windscreen incident. But before that, he'd been a telecommunications engineer with the British Post Office, with the GPO. And he'd been in training for some time with it's called the Youth and Training Program. It actually still exists, this program. Anyway, Mal had this kind of technical background. He was the first person in his family to own a car, to have a house, have a pension. And they were all pretty blown away when Mal decided in August 63 to throw it all over to go on the road with a pop band, essentially, which, most folks figured would have had a shelf life of about 18 months.
He was a bouncer, right, at the Cavern Club.
He was a bouncer, but he always admitted that if anybody ever had to, mix it up and get into a fight, he would have been the first person to run away. He was the cowardly bouncer, but being a big guy, he kind of naturally fell into that role. But yeah, that was just his way of being around the bands. It was George Harrison's idea that Mal would be a bouncer, and it would just be a way to hang out more often and hang out with their friends.
The guy that was supposed to drive the van that night, he got sick.
That was Neil Aspinall, of course, who had been with the Beatles at that point for a good almost 2 years as their driver and their roadie. Neil got the flu. It was during what they called the Big Freeze. It was such a calamitous storm that ice was crawling out into the English Channel for miles. So it was a crazy, crazy weather event, and they needed somebody to drive them down to London because Please Please Me was shooting up the charts. This was the big moment, and they could all tell that something special was happening, and they needed to consolidate it while it was right there in front of them. So Mal drove them down to London. It was on the way back when the windscreen shattered, and the boys made a Beatles sandwich in the back of the van while Mal was wearing I think it was a paper bag that John Lennon had fashioned for him with eye holes as the snow and the wind are pummeling him in the cab. It was just a really bonding moment for them. All along the way, as they made their long trip back to London, they'd say, "How much further?" And he'd say, 200 miles to go, which became this kind of mantra that he would use. His autobiography was going to call it 200 miles to go. Anyway, it was a big bonding moment for them, particularly for Ringo, right, who was pretty new to the band at that point. This mattered to him. For Neil and Brian Epstein, it was a big deal because when Mal brought the van back to the Casbah Coffee Club, where Neil was living at the time with Mona Best, he had gotten the windscreen fixed. And this really blew them away. They couldn't believe that he had gone to that kind of trouble, that he had that level of initiative. And they really stored that piece of information away. As Neil said, 10 out of 10 for Mal for getting that done.
That takes us to that Ed Sullivan performance, February of 64. Countless times you hear the story from all these great classic rock artists. When did you become a musician, or what inspired you? Beatles on Ed Sullivan, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. It's amazing. Tell the story about this performance, because there's some stories behind it that are so fascinating. Mel was in a panic over Ringo's drum kit the first time.
Drumhead.
Yes. And well, the second appearance too, the Beatles were nowhere to be found, only moments before they were to hit the stage. Talk about the Ed Sullivan appearances.
Yeah, when you look at those in retrospect, part of the problem was that they were a pretty well-oiled machine. They do these 25, 30-minute shows. And being on TV in those situations was kind of an aberration, right? So, yeah, the first one, Mal, he loses the drum head. And I think he's probably imagining Brian, who's going to kill him if that drum head is not there, splayed out, screaming the Beatles logo and image. And then the second time, he just loses them. That was when they were at the Deauville Hotel, doing God knows what, lounging around with starlets probably. But yeah, those were crazy moments for Mal. And there were a number of them like that, where he was, essentially the one conduit keeping things together so that all of these cultural epochal moments could take place.
I think what's interesting too is he seemed like a practical person, and then he makes this decision. Like you say, I think his family were surprised that he did this. Was he all along? Was he living a life that he wasn't necessarily happy with, and the Beatles kind of took him into the dream life that he always had? Or was it just a split-second decision that he made and he said, okay, well, here we go?
Oh, no, he wanted it. He had dreams of stardom. He absolutely wanted to maybe even live on the wild side, as they did there for so many years. It's ironic, but the person who the only person in the family who really championed what Mal wanted to do was his wife, Lily.
Hmm.
Everybody else, especially his parents, thought it was ridiculous. His sisters were aghast. They were aghast for much of their lives, actually, long after Mal was dead. In fact, it was his dad who said, everything changed when he got involved with those four lads.
So, well, as we read in the book too, Lily, she was challenged. She had to be quite patient, and that was difficult for her.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I mean. It's ironic in the sense that she was kind of the only person who supported him in this kind of outlandish. I mean, it's a ridiculous decision, right? I was talking with Mark Lewison when I was working on that part of the book, and he reminded me very shrewdly, right, that this was something that happened quite often. Brian Epstein's family also thought, you're nuts. What are you doing messing around with the pop group? We're merchants, damn it. We don't do this. Stu Sutcliffe's sister thought he was insane, to forego his art for a while to think about these guys. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because pop groups then and now, it's like being an actor, right? How many actors actually make a living?
Yeah, well, yeah, hindsight is 2020. Yeah, we know the Beatles, what they became, but if it didn't work out, you just left a solid job. You got a nice stable thing going here. What are you doing?
Not only did Mal leave a solid job, it wasn't going to reopen for him. He had signed the Secrets Act. He'd kind of learned that maybe from his bosses when he was making this transition that it was a good thing he was, because maybe he wasn't working out that well in his role as telecommunications engineer, probably because he was spending so much damn time at the cavern on his lunch break. So it was fortuitous that something was coming up, but man, what a risk to take.
He was about 7, 8 years older than the rest of the guys in the band, if I recall correctly.
Closer to 5. He's 5 years older than John and Ringo, but probably at some level not as mature. The more I study Mal, people would describe him as a big kid, and I think that's true.
Chapter 14, titled The Elvis Situation, and you lead with, quote, "So began one of the strangest series of events in Mal's and the Beatles' story." Can you talk about what happened here? This is 1965, an impromptu jam with Elvis and the Beatles. Wow.
Right. This was kind of cooked up by Colonel Tom Parker and Brian Epstein and Mal. Mal wanted to spend time with Elvis as much, maybe more so than they did, because by 1965, they're just not as impressed with him, right? I mean, all of that had that sheen had tarnished, certainly during Elvis's Hollywood period, right? It was cooked up, though, by Colonel Tom Parker. They went out to Bel Air. I mean, it almost had the feel of a photo op or a party situation, which ironically, there were no photos taken at the party at Elvis's place. And again, while the Beatles were kind of over it to a certain extent, it was kind of Mal who was living the dream and keeping notes that night. Elvis was kind of, they were both intimidated by each other. Elvis, could tell that they were tearing it up and that he wasn't in the level of ascension that he used to be. So it was Mal who was kind of there breaking the ice, helping them when they had their famous jam, etc. But for Mal, it was a massive evening. We've all been wondering all these years. This is one of the first surprises I found, right? We've all wondered all these years what's going on with Mal and the story of what happened with Elvis and the Beatles. And I open up this box right there, and there's like 100 pages that Mal had written about it back in 1965, So that's part of the magic and the strangeness of this project, how so much material exists inside his archives that just answer to the word many of the questions we've been wondering about.
And then Mal contributes to Beatles music, which is really interesting because he goes from Roadie to now they entrust him with his creative input on songs. There's an entry in the book on a song that Paul started working on in late January of 1967. Mal referred to it as Where the Rain Gets In. And the another he called Doors, which became Fixing a Hole. He co-wrote Sgt. Pepper, co-wrote it. That's amazing, but Mal was never credited. Talk about why that happened, what Paul told Mal as the reason and how Mal felt about it.
Well, Mal may have groused at times in his diaries or in his notebooks about various goings on, but he was always committed to them being the enormous success that we know them to be. I mean, that was the mission, that was the brief as far as Mal was concerned. obviously he would have enjoyed it, but we have to, when we think about authorship, particularly of a pop song, it just was completely different back then. These guys were essentially inventing their jobs and their careers. Mal was entrusted with moments like that for one reason, because he was handy, but for another, because he was so motivated. So if Paul said, play this organ note on You Won't See Me, Mal's going to play it, right? Or take up a trumpet on Helter Skelter in that bizarre trumpet sax duet that he plays with John Lennon. Mal was up for anything, walking around the studio with the bass drum. And in retrospect, of course, we know that lots of folks helped out with Beatles songs. Pete Shotton, arguably John's closest friend, right, was very much involved. It did touch off something, though, in Mal. He enjoyed writing songs and he enjoyed working on them. And so when they're in Rishikesh a year later, he begins working on the song that will become You and Me, Babe on Ringo's self-titled 1973 album.
What kind of input? Does he chord structures, lyrics, or is it just that, like you say, they say, hey, pick up the instrument and play? How deep did it go in terms of his input?
Gosh, it really depends, So, I mean, there are times when he's playing downbeat harmonicas, very specific. What would that have been? Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, that was a very clear part that Mal was participating in. If it's percussion, right, it's a very clear brief on what he needs to provide. Mr. McCartney would be known to say, I need a line, and people would contribute during Eleanor Rigby, or at one point with Mal with Here, There, and Everywhere. He needed a way to finish it off. Part of it is simply because when you take any kind of extended look at the Beatles, you discover that they were inordinately busy. These are very driven people who weren't taking time off in any of the ways we think about that today. They were just constantly working. So they would come into the studio with the song mostly finished, but maybe not completely. And they would rely on the creative process in that space in which to bring those kind of compositions to fruition. The thing that's interesting to me about Mal during that period is after they finish the concert years and they move into the studio years, you might have naturally thought, and I would have too, that folks like Mal and Neil would be less in demand. In fact, maybe they'll move back to Liverpool. It was the exact opposite. The Beatles were so driven as artists that they were about to spend more time in the studio, right? More than 700 hours for Sgt. Pepper, more than 1,000 for the White Album. They're now going to put more time in that space, which meant more need for people like Mal and Neil Aspinall to be there for them so that they could carry out those long studio sessions and make all these masterworks that we benefit from.
Interesting. So different from nowadays where artists reach out to other artists from all areas to contribute, but it's like the Beatles world was so insulated. So they would just reach out to those who were there within those confined walls that they had to put up because and they were constantly working. So it was like this bubble.
Yeah.
Whoever's in there, let's see what we can get from them. The Sgt. Pepper's album cover, Mal contributes to that too. He said he never felt so connected to the band as then. What was Mal's relationship like with Brian Epstein?
With Brian, Mal was hired by Brian. Brian kind of paid Mal a premium when he was hired. It was a raise over his job with the post office, which meant that Neil got a raise too. So it was good for both of them in August 1963. But they did bump heads a lot. They were at loggerheads, often over image issues. Brian is so well known for getting the Beatles to wear suits, to changing their approach to the media, to their stage act, to the whole business. And it wasn't that Mal was against any of that. It's just Mal was the roadie, and to move all this equipment around, which quickly became not just the Beatles equipment, but other bands too, because the Beatles had a roadie or two. Most bands had none, right? So Mal would step up and help them out too. He'd want to wear shirt sleeves instead of ties and a jacket. And this rubbed Brian the wrong way. And there were several moments like this when they would really get in each other's faces. At one point, Mal thought Brian was going to hit him, in fact. And it sounds like Brian wanted to. They would just get really in each other's faces over these issues. But fortunately, by the time of Brian's death, Mal and Brian had really buried those sorts of issues. And he chalked it up. And George Martin would speak in similar terms. He chalked it up to almost a kind of jealousy over people getting to spend time with the boys. Yeah, I think that's interesting. At times I've wondered how true it is because I've spoken to a lot of personnel at Abbey Road Studios over the years, and they'll let us know things like, we didn't want to be on Beatles sessions because they went for 14 hours. You didn't want to run that session. Let somebody else do that. They were seen as kind of a chore, right? I get the sense that folks in that, as you said, in that very insular, smaller group, George Martin, Brian Epstein, the Beatles, that maybe those were spaces where maybe people were jealous of each other. I mean, George Martin admitted that he was kind of jealous of Mal at one point. He's got to spend all this time with the Beatles. Well, George Martin would certainly get his fill, right, in 67 and 68, et cetera.
Oh, yeah.
But it's interesting. I guess in any small group like that, right, politics emerge. Some people like each other more than others. Relationships ebb and flow over the years. And these are guys who spent a ridiculous amount of time together. I mean, Mal arguably spent more time with them than wives and girlfriends. I don't think that's even an exaggeration. So when you're in situations like that, obviously grudges develop, people butt heads, et cetera.
But he doesn't think that Brian committed suicide. He felt it was an accidental overdose. Why do you
Right,
think
and
he
there
felt
was
that way?
Yeah, so a lot of folks were sort of concerned at the time that maybe Brian's death had been intentional because, of course, it was especially back in the day when things were happening, it was known inside the Beatles circle that Brian had thought about suicide before. So they all seemed relieved that it was an accident.
Just as the Beatles' relationship was unraveling, Mal's life was also not going well. So I'm going to go back to his marriage. You write in the book, quote, his marriage was increasingly beset by an internal Cold War. There was an out-of-wedlock baby on the way back in London, and his role at Apple appeared to have been built on a foundation of quicksand, shifting by the day and threatening to suffocate him. Can you talk about why Mal was in such a bad place, both personally and professionally around this time, which would be, 67, 68?
Yeah, definitely in 68. And part of the challenge is they've built the Apple enterprise. Naturally, Mal and Neil will have roles in this company. They would like them both to, Mal especially, function in a kind of A&R capacity because Mal loved going to clubs, meeting bands, et cetera, and of course would meet Badfinger, the band that eventually becomes Badfinger. But what they quickly discover when they start making the White Album is they want Mal in the studio. They don't want Mal to be a guy who goes to work every day and goes to Apple, wherever Apple happens to be. Ultimately, it's Savile Row. But they want Mal to be the guy who waits on them, in the words of his sister Barbara, who mothers them, right? They want the guy who will make a meal at 2 a.m. or, is there just because they like having him there. He's good-natured. He's fun to be around, by everybody's admission. So this kind of tore at Mal because, like a lot of folks, he has his own ambitions. He's imagining other kinds of opportunities, and it's becoming clear that in a way he's being typecast. He understands the practicality of why he's being typecast, but he is being typecast as the road manager. He's also, by this point, put his wife through several levels of hell, right? Being gone for so long, raising the kids at times by herself. She's had evidence here and there that Mal is seeing other women, if not having full-on relationships. To call her long suffering is kind of minimizing. In fact, I told Gary, we were kicking around, whom do we dedicate this book to? I said, it's your mother. And she was alive then. This was, 2 or 3 years ago. I said, your mom is the only person this book gets to be dedicated to. She is the person who made it possible and then suffered, nearly every day for the rest of her life over it. So
yeah, well, there's a part in the book too when he gets injured, he comes home for a little bit and he can't wait to get back out of the house. And she's like, you're just here for a few weeks, right? What was that part? I think
just so we wash your clothes. What's this about? And
so I didn't know. So she recently passed just within the last few.
She died just a few months ago, actually.
Oh.
And unfortunately, it had been a while since she's been coherent. She had kind of an advanced dementia. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to interview her. Gary tried to send her my questions a few times, but to no avail. You mentioned the out of wedlock child, a son. I'm so proud of, one of the earliest things I learned about in this project was that this fellow existed, and I've spoken to him, and he's terrific. There was some back and forth as we worked on it. What do we do? What do you, and do you include this story? how germane is it at times? And I got to give Gary and Julie so much credit. They said, we spent so many of our years feeling disconnected from our father. Imagine what this guy has felt like. And they said, he has to be included and acknowledged. And I was just so impressed with them for understanding that and making sure that there was space for him in this story.
Interesting comments from Mal regarding those January 69 Let It Be recording sessions when George quit the band. He certainly didn't blame George for getting frustrated with Paul. He also wasn't happy with John's behavior after George left Twickenham Studios. He couldn't believe John actually considered replacing him with Eric Clapton.
Yeah, there was a lot of stress there. And if I had a critique of the docuseries from Peter Jackson, it would just be that we really did not get a full window into what was going on with George. George had his own problems at home with Patty during this time. She rightly left him for a while, if only a few weeks or even a few days. And during that period, John had some unresolved George issues. George had said some kind of catty things about Yoko in the previous months, and John had regretted not saying anything at the time. So there was this kind of Cold War between those two guys. But yeah, Mal was very, very frustrated. He was so busy, though. I kind of get a laugh when I read the moments when George and Ringo sort of briefly leave the band. Ringo got up from his drums and walked away. George left Twickenham and drove away. He just kind of minimizes it with this single sentence when these things happen.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Ken Womack is the author of Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. It's out now. Later in the book, we read about Mal's financial frustrations. He thought that being loved by the four Beatles would eventually result in them paying him more money, but he was only making around $50 a week after taxes. I think that's maybe equivalent to maybe $65,000, $70,000 a year. I was doing the inflation on that one. What were his feelings towards the band regarding that? Did he just think they were going to give him a raise? Should he have gone to them? I think he was hesitant about that. He probably was afraid that maybe they'd say, hey, take it or leave it.
I doubt they would have said that, but I think the problem for Mal is he had to have known at some level intellectually that the reason his money was not going very far was the fact that he was living a double life, that he was out carousing and he would go off. I mean, imagine, you've read the book. There'll be these long stretches when he goes to the United States with George, right? Months. And he'll keep saying, well, I'm coming home soon. And then one time, I think it's in 68, right? He doesn't come home until well after Thanksgiving. It's ridiculous how long he's gone. I think he's not sending money home. Lily's having to rely on Mal's relatives to help out, to help pay for things. So I think at a certain level, he must realize that he's living beyond his means. I mean, they do okay when they sell the house in Liverpool and they move to London. And his salary is pretty good until it isn't, which is in the early 1970s when there are some inflationary inflection points that really begin to take their toll on what Mal and Neil were making at that point. But until then, they were doing all right. With Mal, and again, this is all retrospect and would have been no use to him at the time. But with Mal, it's always bad timing when it comes to things like compensation, because the time when he needed those raises were the early 70s. And by then, the Beatles are in receivership. Nobody's getting any raise, right? I mean, they are essentially their money's frozen and they're just still being paid because Mal and Neil are the only two employees of Beatles and Company. So that just was bad timing. And then, of course, the bad timing of the way Mal exits the story. With all of these wonderful tidings happening the last few months, I'm reminded, as I always am around this time in the Beatles commercial cycle, that Mal would have been a part of all of this, right? Had Mal lived, he would have been there in the 80s for those great moments of Renaissance, in the 90s with the anthology, right? The remasters, Beatles Love, you name it, it goes on. And Mal would have been playing Beatles Rock Band and profiting as Neil would from these ventures. So his timing, which, is a reality in all of our lives, matters here. It affects Mal deeply.
There's a picture in the book. He sketches an image of Paul, and this is referring to an incident at Olympic Studios. he just couldn't put it into words. I mean, he witnessed the tensions firsthand. What happened there?
Well, that had to have been a primal moment that I'm sure Mal thought of in retrospect. He drew a picture based on a character named Maisie from The Perishers, an old British cartoon. It was a picture of Paul losing his mind, which by Mr. McCartney's own account, he did that night when the other Beatles were there to cajole him into signing with Alan Klein. And Paul lost it, of course, and was angry. It was the first thing I looked up when I got this cache of material. I want to see what happened. How did Mal deal with May 9th, 1969? And there it was, just a picture of Paul losing his mind. And I'm sure Mal was feeling it. And the tremors of that evening would never abate, right? I mean, as Paul said, we were never able to put it back together again after that night. And of course, Alan Klein would exert a horrible effect on Mal's career. Certainly with the Beatles, he tries to fire famously Mal and Neil eventually, and not too long after that, but also because Alan, in a terrible act of cruelty, will not let Mal continue with Badfinger. It is just a ghastly moment in this story, and it really breaks Mal when Alan begins playing games with him, because Mal sincerely wanted to help that band. And of course, as you know, it's hard to find a bigger tragedy in the history of rock than Badfinger.
There is such a dark cloud over that band. He did work with the guys in the Beatles, even after the Beatles broke up officially, not officially during that period. But then his relationship with Paul ends rather abruptly. And when I first read this, I thought, boy, that's pretty cold on Paul's part. But Mal later said he understood why it was so abrupt. Talk about what Paul said to him. This is when he's recording Maybe I'm Amazed.
Yeah, it's right around that when they're in the studio. That was, one of the songs Paul knew needed to get the Studio 2 treatment. So they'd gone into the studio, and Mal had been secretly helping Paul for weeks. In fact, not telling Neil about it, which kind of chagrined Neil because, they usually were the two guys who were really upfront with each other. But, in retrospect, again, it makes perfect sense. You can almost see one of the Eastmen saying, look, Paul, if you're trying to sue to dissolve this band, if you're going to do that, you can't keep using Mal. He is a benefit of Beatles and Company. So you kind of have to cut everything off and go your own way. And so he tells Mal, I don't need you anymore. And it comes off really cruelly. And I imagine Paul, in retrospect, recognized that maybe those weren't the best words, but, he really had to cut himself off if he's going to try to sue to end the partnership. If you're using a benefit of the partnership, it doesn't make any sense. But Mal understood. And in every divorce, we have to worry about the children. And in this case, the children went to John, George, and Ringo. And Mal was kept very busy in those years with arguably the best solo efforts. When you look retrospectively at the Beatles, those first 4 or 5 years are when the great music's getting made. The further you get away from the big bang of the Beatles, it becomes less so for everybody.
Yeah, he's involved with Beatles solo projects, Harry Nilsson, and you mentioned Badfinger. What exactly happens with Badfinger? How does he get involved, and then how does it end?
Well, he's involved because he discovers them as the Ivies in the Marquee Club. He champions them at Apple, gets them a contract. So a lot of trouble was brewing already because they had a manager, a guy named Billy Collins, who was very paranoid and was always worried about his own status. And so he was a problem. But then also, Alan was demonstrating pretty early on in his tenure at Apple that if an artist wasn't the Beatles, they weren't going to get the same attention, which kind of makes a natural level of sense at Apple. But almost immediately, they're in the act of breaking up and in the long range story of breaking up their partnership. So very quickly, Badfinger begins to be mothballed, right? Now, they've written a song, Without You, which becomes this international hit for Harry Nilsson and is making pots of money, but the money's going into receivership and probably being absconded by a business manager, Stan Polly. So there's some really troubling threads to what's happening with Badfinger. Mal's trying to keep them along and keep them moving forward and records No Matter What with them, this really wonderful song, which he begins trying to champion around the hallways of Apple. Well, the problem is The Beatles aren't going to the hallways of Apple like they used to, right? I mean, when you start breaking up, everybody moves away and they're staying at their own mansions, etc., more than they're coming into the city to Savile Row. So Mal's having a lot of trouble getting traction for this song. It only gets released because of a guy who lives just north of me here in New Jersey, Alan Steckler. Alan was hired as a consultant by Alan Klein. He listens to the music and he says, "You've got a hit here. This needs to be released." And of course it is, and it becomes this almost signature hit for Badfinger. But by then, Alan Klein has forbidden Mal from working with Badfinger, just really out of cruelty, probably because he could not fire Mal. And he made Neil suffer too in his own way. So it's just another nail in the coffin of Badfinger. They're really on a kind of life support at this point. They're big enough, and they have some hits later with George Harrison, Day After Day, that sort of keep them moving along. But they're on life support. Eventually, in '75, Pete dies first, and then Tom Evans later. It's just awful.
I wonder in 2023 when I hear these songs, no matter what, and then Breaking Bad was is it Baby Blue? That was on
Yeah.
Breaking Bad. Who gets the publishing on these songs? And there's one surviving member of the band, right?
Sure, Joey is still with us, and Joey is very helpful for this book. Gave me great point-by-point analysis of what happened in the studio when they were working with Mal. The publishing has been going to their relations. A guy named Dan Matavina, who died a few months ago, way too young, great guy. Dan had been working to help out the families, and he'd been sort of their executor. Yeah, so and
That's good to know.
actually he helped close the Breaking Bad deal, and actually wrote a marvelous book called Without You, which details what happened.
Oh, I'd like to read that.
Yeah, it's a great book. In fact, he re-released it, I believe, earlier this year on ebooks.
There's a story. It has to do with George's guitar being stolen. So this is a guitar given to George by Eric Clapton. And then Mal gets involved with a woman named Pandora, and somehow he's in the center of this. Pandora visits George's house Friday the 13th, by the way, Friday, April 13th, this time with some friends. And those friends happen to burglarize George's house. One of the things they take is George's cherry red Gibson guitar that had been a present from Eric Clapton. And this is just insane, this whole story. They eventually get it back. But Mal's the one who gets the call in the middle of the night from Pandora, and he's somehow in the middle of all this.
Yeah, and somebody out there knows Pandora's name, and they need to contact me. I spent so much time trying to find her. It is it's like a nutty story that can only happen in Southern California
Yes.
in the early 1970s, right? It's this strange woman, and at a certain point, and there was too much to tell in this story, but people like Cher get involved. They go to the Playboy Mansion at one point, and Mal's like, "We can't get in the Playboy Mansion," and she's like, "Sure we can." And they drive through, and she pushes the intercom, and they say, "Who is it?" She says, "It's Cher. Let me in, damn it." And of course they do. It's Cher, damn it. So
you can't make this stuff up.
It's a crazy, crazy story where Mal eventually goes to Mexico to track down this guitar, and he has to horse trade to get it back. He has to find another guitar that's like it. It's just ridiculous. Just absolutely nuts, that story. I mean, you can almost see it being some weird screenplay.
Yeah. Mal separated from his wife in 1973, which he never seemed to get past, but he did move on. He moved to Los Angeles. He begins a relationship with Fran Hughes. She encouraged Mal to start writing his memoir. This would lift his spirits since he's been battling depression and anxiety for a while. Can you talk about where Mal Evans was mentally leading up to that final tragic day in January of '76 and the cryptic writings in his notebook in May of '75?
To call it a separation is probably slightly inaccurate in the sense that Mal was just going to LA on another trip, right, to work with the guys. John was out there full time at that point on the Lost Weekend. And to call it a separation, it was a separation, but it was one that was not supposed to be official. It's just Mal gets busted for moving into this with this woman. and he gets busted by John Lennon's ex-wife Cynthia and John's son Julian, who say, "Hey, Fran, Lil, we met your cousin Fran," and she's like, "What cousin?" It was kind of a classic. Mal wasn't a very good philanderer. I don't know how else to put it, and he got busted for it. And at that point, really, there's a ticking clock on Mal Evans because he's now been once and truly outed to his wife about who he is when he's not there at the house. He's living with another woman. And it's a matter of time until Lily finally gets up the courage to say, "You know what, I might divorce you." And just the idea that she might creates this incredible stress for Mal. Life should have been good for him. He'd produced a hit song for Badfinger. He had a song on a blockbuster album for Ringo. So he's getting residuals, he's getting opportunities. But the fact that his worlds have collided in this way really creates pretty severe depression for him, and probably much worse than people knew, I would imagine. At least he was with, I look at it this way. I mean, it's a strange kind of ironic way to look at it, but at least he was with Fran. Fran was tough. Fran, who was much younger than Mal, probably was looking out for him and helping him through this period. It was her idea to do the memoirs, to give him something meaningful to do. When he would miss his family, Fran had the wherewithal, even though, again, she was a young woman, to say, "Well, go back to your family. They exist. They're in London. You know where it is. Head on over." And Mal was just torn. It probably didn't help that there was so much free-flowing alcohol and cocaine in Southern California. But it was Fran's idea to write the memoirs. And she even helped him to engineer how to do the deal with Harold Lipton as their attorney. Fran was doing a lot of smart things. She had them incorporate her company, Frantic Enterprises. Mal didn't finish the paperwork on his. It was going to be called Malcontented. But, all of this is taking place, and Mal really throws himself deeply into this project. It's stressful at times because he's worried that he'll betray the boys and their trust, which I don't think he really does. But he throws himself into this project. He hires a team, gets a woman named Joanne Leonard to be the stenographer. Mal will dictate the manuscript to her, hires another guy, her boyfriend, actually, John Hornley, who was a former art director at Capitol. And John would be the photo editor because Mal knew the photos would be important, and he had this whole collection of thousands of photos. So John's job was to have transparencies made so that they could eventually ship them off to New York to the publisher. And Mal finished the thing in late 1975. It was essentially done. It just needed to be sent in so that they could publish it. I think they were aiming for June for a publication date, or at least that was the first date that they were considering. So, it was ready to go. It's just that moment, that late moment in 75, early 76, when Lily finally said, "I'm going to get an attorney," that Mal just, probably to use the language of the day, he freaked.
What were those cryptic writings in the notebook, May of 75, that seemed to
I don't
concern
exactly
people?
know. It was around the time that Fran and Mal visited Robert Markel, who was the editor-in-chief at Grosset, and something was going on in Mal's head about how his life had begun in 63 when he joined the Beatles full time, and now he felt like it was ending. I kind of left it there for the reader to think about, which I did on more than one occasion in this book. To my mind, Mal is frankly not thinking straight. He is ideating various kinds of realities in his life that aren't real. There was nothing over about the Beatles, right? Even when he tried to quit the year before, nobody really believed it, right? It wasn't really going to happen. They never stopped paying him. George said famously, "So what?" He thought it was ridiculous, So it's really interesting stuff. I think Mal was formulating that in his own mind because, of course, the Beatles were calling him all the time. Not too long after that, the partnership finally over. Paul's in touch again more regularly. Everything's hunky-dory. It was Ken Mansfield who said on the day that Mal died, he said, "Mal, you're telling me all these wonderful things that are happening, but you sound awful. What's going on?" And of course, Mal was in the throes, and probably had been for a while, of a full-on mental crisis.
So heartbreaking. if he had just reached out for help. But I don't know, those days people didn't readily admit they needed help too. I think he just tried to battle it on his own. And
Yeah, you got that right. I mean, that
Yeah.
was a completely different era in terms of healthcare and mental health care and gender, right? I mean, Mal would have been a stoic Liverpool man who's 40, cut from
Yeah.
a very different cloth than even his counterparts necessarily in LA. So, I don't even know if he knew how to begin to do that. And Fran, and she's wonderful in this way, is kind of no nonsense. She would have been like, well, then go back, But of course, imagine how Mal would have taken that. Well, you don't love me then? I can just, so I think no matter where he turned, he must have felt confused. He told Laura Gross, a good friend of his at the time, he said, if only I could go somewhere and clear my mind for a while. He knew instinctively, he knew that was important, but of course he doesn't do it.
No.
And there was a place he could have cleared his mind, right? His house that he owned with Lily outside of London.
Just a little bit of time away from everything can do that for you, and it never happens. And as the promo for the book states, Mal's untimely death has always been shrouded in mystery, and it's an emotional read, what transpires, without giving away too much from the book. Can you talk about what happens on January 4th, 1976, and what leads to the mystery?
The signs were there. Fran was probably hoping against hope that Mal had righted himself. The night before, in a kind of drunken fit, he had written his last will and testament, which was his suicide note, essentially. And then the next day, which is a Sunday night, they were taking down the Christmas tree. She thought everything was okay, that maybe it was an aberration the evening before. But man, it wasn't. And Mal began to act erratically. And I'm of the mind that he'd been planning this for some time. Got out his gun, his Winchester rifle that Fran had given him for his birthday in May 74. And that scared John Hornley, who had come over because Fran was concerned. She would often call folks to come over if she thought Mal was getting erratic. Well, Hornley saw the gun and he got the hell out of that bedroom. And she said, do you want me to call the police? I'm going to call the police. Mal's like, you call them. And at that point, he was waiting for them to come upstairs to tell him to drop the gun. And as we know, Mal pointed it at them, and cops do what cops do. But yeah, this is all, it's interesting the way history has looked at this event as though it's mistaken identity or an accident or a domestic dispute. Really, it's what we now call suicide by cop, right? I guess the saving grace is Mal didn't take anybody else with him.
Yeah.
With Mal's story, with Badfinger's story, there's always plenty of misery to go around, I've noticed.
I think his story would have ended so much better than maybe, just thinking of, Jimmy Nicol, the Beatles drummer for,
Wherever he is.
Right. But, for him, Mal Evans would have been a celebrated, beloved figure. He would have really, I think, enjoyed all of the admiration and adoration from the fans as we get into the 80s and 90s and 2000s. It's just that's what I was left thinking about after finishing the book. It's like, boy, only if, like you say, he just got away for maybe a month, 2 months, even a year if he needed, get cleaned up, and he would have been okay. That's the thing. You
wonder about. Yeah. I mean, obviously he still has the baggage that others did at the time that, well, surely the Beatles are just a pop group. They're not going to really be talking about them in 10 years. But of course, we do. We will continue to do so for, I would think, centuries. But what's interesting about that moment is I don't even know that Mal could see a glint of what the future looked like, And of course, when one is in a mental health crisis or in a state of depression, you can't see anything that looks like a saving grace because all of it was there. He'd just spoken to Neil about what they were going to do with putting Apple back together, which would have been a role for Mal. He was talking to Paul, talked to John the week of his death. It was all there. But the one area that he'd neglected for so long that was the biggest chasm of grief for him, his family back in London. That was the part that was his undoing.
Living the Beatles Legend, the untold story of Mal Evans, and it's out now through Day Street Books, and you can find it wherever books are sold. And Ken Womack, where can people find you online? You have your podcast still too, right?
I do. I'm still doing everything Fab 4. Yeah, we have a new episode coming soon on the founder of the Violent Femmes.
Oh, wow.
They're wonderful. But I got to say, I really enjoyed your last episode with Tom Werman. That was great.
Oh, yes, huh? How about, he's got some stories.
He does, and such an
Thank
important figure in the story of Cheap Trick. And that was very interesting. But yeah, still doing the podcast, everything Fab 4 with salon.com. And then I have a website, kennethwomack.com. Bring your friends. You're always welcome.
Ken, thank you so much. I think there's a chance you'll be back on again in the future. I would think you got some more projects in the works.
I have some things cooking up. Maybe you'll even have myself and Jason Krupa back.
Yeah.
The guy I went down with. Yeah, we're working on a new book right now called Beatles 74.
Oh,
About
nice.
the end of the partnership. Yeah. So we're going to probably be done in a couple months. We're excited about that.
Well, I'm sure Beatles fans are thankful that Mal's story has finally been told in proper form. A book on Mal. I couldn't believe that there wasn't one on him up until now.
Well, it was impossible to adequately tell his story without those materials. It's sort of walking through the looking glass, right? The story we knew of Mal existed in sort of one dimension. And then when you add in his own voice and his own words that he's writing and composing contemporaneously with events happening, it really changes everything.
Ken Womack, this was great to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.